The flight proceeded smoothly, the first-class cabin quiet, until a single moment changed everything. An elderly gentleman politely asked a flight attendant to bring a glass of water for his wife. The response? A cold shake of the head, a sharp tone dripping with disdain, as if they didn't belong there. Other passengers began to notice. Whispers spread through the cabin. But no one spoke up. The flight attendant continued her duties, unaware that her fate had already been sealed. Because the couple she had just humiliated? They weren't ordinary passengers. They were the owners of the airline. And by the time the plane landed, she wouldn't simply be serving drinks anymore. She would be facing a decision that could end her career forever. The plane was in the process of boarding, and passengers were settling into their seats one by one. Amid the stream of people, an elderly couple, Arthur and Eleanor Harrington, walked slowly down the aisle. Their hands intertwined, each step carried the calmness of those who had weathered life's ups and downs. Arthur, in a neatly pressed navy blue suit, walked with a confident yet unassuming air. Eleanor, in a simple yet elegant cream dress, exuded natural grace. They weren't in a hurry. They didn't seem out of place. Please translate this into English without omitting any content. The flight proceeded smoothly, the first-class cabin quiet, until a single moment changed everything. An elderly gentleman politely asked a flight attendant to bring a glass of water for his wife. The response? A cold shake of the head, a sharp tone dripping with disdain, as if they didn't belong there. Other passengers began to notice. Whispers spread through the cabin. But no one spoke up. The flight attendant continued her duties, unaware that her fate had already been sealed. Because the couple she had just humiliated? They weren't ordinary passengers. They were the owners of the airline. And by the time the plane landed, she wouldn't simply be serving drinks anymore. She would be facing a decision that could end her career forever. The plane was in the process of boarding, and passengers were settling into their seats one by one. Amid the stream of people, an elderly couple, Arthur and Eleanor Harrington, walked slowly down the aisle. Their hands intertwined, each step carried the calmness of those who had weathered life's ups and downs. Arthur, in a neatly pressed navy blue suit, walked with a confident yet unassuming air. Eleanor, in a simple yet elegant cream dress, exuded natural grace. They weren't in a hurry. They didn't seem out of place. But the scrutinizing glances from a few other passengers, the silent looks that seemed to question whether they truly belonged in this first-class cabin, were not lost on them. Still, Arthur and Eleanor maintained their composure, unfazed by the meaningless judgments around them. They reached their seats, 2A and 2B, carefully stowing their small luggage in the overhead compartment. Eleanor gently sat down first, exhaling softly as she leaned back into the seat. Her fingers lightly squeezed her husband's hand, a habit that had lasted for decades. Eleanor's hand brushed against the armrest, an unconscious gesture. She was tired, the long hours of travel had drained her. Arthur sat down beside her, glancing around before pressing the call button for the flight attendant. He wasn't expecting any trouble. It was just a simple request. A glass of water for Eleanor, who had been feeling slightly dehydrated since their last layover. A few seconds later, Mara Rowan, a seasoned flight attendant, appeared. Her uniform was impeccably pressed, her posture perfectly upright, but in her eyes, there was something else. A hint of arrogant confidence. Mara had been serving first-class cabins for years, and in her mind, she thought she knew exactly the kind of people who usually sat in these seats. Without glancing at their tickets, without considering why they might be here, she had already made her judgment. Crossing her arms, Mara stood there waiting. Arthur smiled politely, gesturing toward Eleanor. "Could we get a glass of water, please? My wife isn't feeling well." Mara pursed her lips slightly, her posture stiffening. "Water will be served with the meal." The reply was cold, and she didn't even bother to look at them. Her tone wasn't outright rude, but it carried an unspoken implication. Disdain. As if their request was nothing more than an inconvenience. Arthur tilted his head slightly, his expression still calm. "I understand, but she just needs a small sip. If you could bring it now, we'd greatly appreciate it." Mara let out a soft sigh, as though she had more important things to do. "Sir, we have a service schedule for a reason. If I bring water for one passenger early, others will start making the same request. I'm sure you can wait like everyone else." A few nearby passengers glanced over. Some passengers glanced at the exchange, but no one spoke up. A few shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others quickly looked away, pretending not to hear anything. Near the galley, Sienna Hale, a trainee flight attendant, stood observing the situation. She hesitated, her fingers twitching slightly at her sides. But she said nothing. Sienna was still new to the job, and she had quickly learned that questioning Mara Rowan was never a good idea. Eleanor gently touched her husband's hand, silently signaling that he should let it go. She wasn't the type to argue over small matters. But Arthur, though always composed, didn't believe in letting injustice slide. His face remained expressionless as he withdrew his hand from the call button, giving a slight nod as if accepting Mara's decision. Mara, satisfied that she had ended the conversation, turned on her heel and walked away without another word. Arthur leaned back in his seat, his expression still unchanged. But he reached into his suit pocket, pulling out his phone. No rush. No fuss. Simply typing out a brief message and sending it. Then he placed the phone on the tray table, interlaced his fingers and quietly gazed out the window. Eleanor tilted her head slightly to look at him, her voice soft. Are you sure you want to handle it this way? Arthur gave a faint smile, his tone as calm as hers. She'll understand soon enough. The moment had passed, but something still lingered in the air. Something Mara Rowan hadn't noticed. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Mara continued moving briskly through the first-class cabin, rearranging trays, serving drinks to other passengers. She had no idea. That brief exchange with the elderly couple was about to change her life forever. The earlier conversation had quickly faded from Mara's mind. After years of working as a flight attendant, she was used to shutting down unnecessary requests neatly. First-class service was about luxury, but more importantly it was about maintaining order. If she started bending the rules for one passenger, she'd be running back and forth all flight, and she had no patience for that. Near the galley, Sienna Hale still watched Mara with hesitant eyes. She was new to first class, but the way Mara handled the situation didn't sit right with her. Water? Such a simple request. Was it really that hard to bring them a glass? Sienna hesitated, then spoke softly, keeping her voice low enough so no one else could hear. Mara, are you sure? That woman really looks exhausted. Mara immediately turned, her sharp eyes locking onto Sienna, her irritation clear on her face. Sienna, let me give you some advice. If you want to last in first class, don't question how things are run. They can wait like everyone else. Sienna bit her lip, nodding slightly, accepting the warning. But the unease in her didn't fade. She had seen Mara act like this before, dismissing passengers she deemed unimportant. Usually it all happened so smoothly, no one had any reason to complain. But this time something felt different. Meanwhile, Arthur Harrington sat quietly in his seat, watching as Mara moved from passenger to passenger. To some she offered a friendly smile. To others she was almost completely dismissive. Beside him, Eleanor had closed her eyes, trying to rest. But Arthur noticed a faint furrow on her brow. She wasn't angry, but he knew his wife well enough to see something was bothering her. The phone on the tray vibrated softly. Arthur picked it up, glancing briefly at the screen. Message received. Understood. A faint smile crossed his lips. He turned off the screen and set the phone down again. No need to rush. The plane was in the air. Everything would resolve itself soon enough. Mara continued her rounds, stopping by a well-dressed businessman in seat 1C. She flashed a professional, radiant smile. Would you like champagne or a cocktail to start, sir? Her voice was smooth, confident. The man barely looked up from his tablet. Just water. Without hesitation, Mara nodded immediately. Of course, sir. She poured water from a chilled bottle behind her, placing the glass gently on his tray table. She even added a napkin, ensuring everything was presented perfectly. Arthur observed the exchange. His face showed no emotion. He didn't say a word. He didn't even turn to look at Mara. But the message was clear. The moment Mara denied him and Eleanor for simply asking for a glass of water, claiming it was against the rules, she had revealed her true self. She didn't deny everyone, just them. Eleanor stirred beside him, slowly opening her eyes. She had heard the man's request, heard how Mara responded smoothly without hesitation. She didn't react, only quietly placed her hand on Arthur's arm, feeling the calm steadiness in him. A few steps away, Sienna had seen it all too. Her stomach tightened as she watched Mara glide through the first-class cabin with practiced ease, attending to some passengers, while ignoring others. Before she could stop herself, Sienna took a small step forward and whispered, Mara, didn't you say water was only served with the meal? Mara barely glanced at Sienna, almost not bothering to acknowledge her. "Different," she whispered back. "He's a regular in first class." Sienna froze. The way Mara said it, casually as if it were an unspoken rule everyone should understand, made something inside her clench. She wanted to object, but she knew it wouldn't change anything. Mara was a senior flight attendant. Questioning her too much could cost Sienna her job. On the other side of the cabin, Arthur Harrington quietly picked up his phone again. He typed a brief message before setting the phone down. "Ensure the captain is informed. No confrontation. Let her finish her shift." Eleanor exhaled softly, her voice low enough for only Arthur to hear. "She still doesn't realize, does she?" A faint smile crossed Arthur's lips. "Not yet." The plane continued its steady flight through the vast sky. No turbulence. No interruptions. But in the first-class cabin, things had already begun to shift. Mara Rowan had no idea that her control was slipping away. Mara continued moving through the first-class cabin with her usual confidence, unaware of the silent storm brewing around her. She had been doing this job for years, and in her mind she knew exactly how things worked. There were passengers who deserved more attention. Frequent flyers. People who looked like they belonged. The others? Just filling the seats. She didn't even bother glancing back at Arthur and Eleanor Harrington as she went about her duties. In Mara's mind, they had been dealt with. Just an elderly couple. Probably saved their whole lives to afford a single first-class ticket. She had no intention of giving them any more attention. Mara didn't spare another second worrying about them. Across the aisle, Arthur Harrington sat calmly, his hands folded in his lap. He didn't seem upset or impatient. In fact, he looked completely at ease. But inside, he was observing every moment, every choice Mara was making. Eleanor remained silent beside him. But Arthur knew. She was paying attention to every detail too. Suddenly, a soft chime sounded from the cabin's intercom. A deep, calm voice spoke. "Ms. Rowan, please report to the cockpit." Mara frowned but didn't hesitate. She quickly adjusted her uniform, hurried toward the front of the plane, and disappeared behind the cockpit door. In the back, Sienna swallowed hard, feeling that something was about to happen. Inside the cockpit, Captain Roland Vance turned to face Mara as she entered. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes carried a certain weight. On the screen in front of him, the intercom was connected to a call from the airline's executive office. Mara's stomach tightened. She had never been summoned to the cockpit mid-flight before. The voice on the other end of the line came through, calm but firm. "Miss Rowan, we've received a priority notification regarding your service in first class. We need you to clarify a few things." Mara straightened her back, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Of course, sir. What's the issue?" A brief pause. Then the voice continued. "An elderly couple in seats 2A and 2B requested water before the meal service. You denied them." Mara's heart rate began to climb. "That's correct, but..." "Then you served water to another passenger without hesitation." The cockpit suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. Mara clenched her hands slightly, keeping her voice calm. That passenger is a regular in first class. I was just following." Captain Vance looked at Mara for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he pressed a button, reopening the communication line. "Ms. Rowan, do you know who the couple in seats 2A and 2B are?" Mara blinked, confused by the question. "No, I don't." The voice on the other end cut her off before she could finish. "Arthur and Eleanor Harrington. They are the owners of this airline." It felt like the ground had vanished beneath her feet. Her throat went dry. Her mind raced, replaying every moment. How she had spoken to them. How she had dismissed them without a second thought. She had refused to serve the very people who had built the airline she worked for. The voice on the call continued, no longer neutral but icy cold. "You will return to them immediately. You will correct your mistake. And when this plane lands, you will answer for your actions before the executive board. Do you understand?" Mara swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Yes, sir." Captain Vance exhaled heavily, then turned back to the controls. "Then you'd better get back to work." Mara turned and left the cockpit, suddenly feeling the weight of every step. The reality of what she had just done finally began to sink in, and she had no idea just how much worse it was about to get. Stepping out of the cockpit, Mara's breathing was faster than usual. The hum of the plane's engines remained steady, but for the first time she barely heard it. Her mind raced, replaying every word from the executive call. She had humiliated the very owners of the airline. Her stomach churned, but she forced herself to keep her face calm. She couldn't let the passengers notice anything was wrong, but her hands still trembled slightly. Mara took a deep breath, adjusted her uniform and tried to steady herself. Near the galley, Sienna watched as Mara walked by. She caught a flicker of unease on Mara's face, an expression she had never seen before. Mara Rowan was always in control, always confident. But now, she looked like she had just seen a ghost. Mara stopped just a few steps away from Arthur and Eleanor Harrington's seats. For the first time she really looked at them. Arthur sat comfortably, relaxed in posture, but his presence carried an invisible weight. Eleanor remained graceful, her fingers gently placed on her lap. No sign of anger. They were not upset. They did not demand anything. They were just waiting. Mara swallowed, leaning slightly forward to meet their gaze. Her voice softer than before, but still carrying a forced professional tone. Mr. and Mrs. Harrington. She carefully chose her words. There has been a misunderstanding earlier. I would like to offer my apologies and invite you for a drink. Arthur slowly turned his head, his gaze meeting hers. A misunderstanding? His voice was calm, steady, but there was something in the way he spoke that made Mara's spine go cold. Mara nodded quickly, forcing out a strained smile. Yes, She hesitated, carefully choosing her words. I didn't realize that we were important? Arthur asked, his voice still unchanged, but his gaze was unreadable. Mara felt her face flush with heat. No, sir, that's not what I meant. You didn't ask for anyone else's ticket. Eleanor spoke for the first time. Her voice was still calm, even gentle, but each word felt like a weight pressing down on Mara's chest. You had no hesitation serving others. Except for us. Mara felt the heaviness in every word they said. A few nearby passengers had begun to turn their heads slightly, pretending not to hear. But everyone was listening. Clearly everyone was listening. Arthur leaned slightly forward, his gaze never leaving Mara. Tell me, Miss Rowan, why did you think we didn't belong here? Mara opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. There was no way to defend herself. No excuse that wouldn't sound hollow. She had made a terrible mistake. Mara swallowed. I misjudged the situation. Finally she spoke. Arthur looked at her for a long time, not rushing to respond. Then he leaned back in his seat, his voice calm but sharp. If you're going to apologize, Miss Rowan, I suggest you do it the right way. Mara felt like she was choking. She had spent her entire career controlling situations like this. She was the one who set the rules. She was the one who maintained order. But now, she had no control left. She took a shaky breath. I sincerely apologize. Her voice dropped. I was wrong. Eleanor gave a small nod but didn't say anything. Arthur didn't thank her. He didn't need to. Mara stood there for a moment longer, feeling exposed under the heavy silence of their presence. Then, unable to bear it any longer, she turned and hurried back toward the kitchen. Her uniform suddenly felt too tight. The authority she once had vanished. She had never felt so small. And for the first time, she realized that this was just the beginning. Mara walked quickly toward the kitchen, her heart pounding in a way she had never experienced before. Arthur's gaze. Eleanor's calm but sharp voice. It was unlike any passengers Mara had ever faced. They didn't shout. They didn't demand compensation. They didn't threaten to file complaints. No, this was worse. Arthur Harrington could end her career with just one decision. And she had handed that decision to him. Sienna stood near the service counter when Mara hurried past her. Are you okay? Sienna asked cautiously, noticing that Mara's face was turning pale. Mara ignored her, grabbing a serving tray, her hands shaking as she arranged the cups and glasses, pretending to focus on her work. But Sienna wasn't convinced. You look like you've seen a ghost, she said softly. Mara finally exhaled, closing her eyes for a moment before murmuring under her breath. I think I just ruined my entire career. Sienna frowned, glancing quickly toward the first-class cabin, where Arthur and Eleanor Harrington were still sitting, calm and composed as if nothing had happened. What do you mean? Mara hesitated. She couldn't admit what had just happened in the cockpit. But Sienna's gaze remained fixed on her, waiting for an answer. Before Mara could say anything, the intercom suddenly buzzed. She flinched. Sienna reached for the phone before Mara could stop her. First-class galley. She answered professionally, then paused, her brow slightly raised. Yes, she's here. She handed the phone to Mara. It's for you. Mara's stomach tightened as she took the receiver. Her voice was smaller than she intended. "This is Mara Rowan." The voice on the other end was sharp and cold. "Ms. Rowan, the executive board has been informed. You are to report to the meeting room immediately after landing. Mr. Harrington has requested a full review of the incident. There will be a disciplinary hearing." It felt like a punch to the chest. Mara opened her mouth trying to speak. "I understand," confirmed. The voice cut her off, giving her no chance to react. She swallowed hard. "Yes, received." The other end hung up. Mara clenched the phone in her hand, then slowly put it down. Sienna had observed everything. "What's going on?" Mara turned sharply to Sienna, her voice harsher than she intended. "Nothing. Just focus on your work." But she knew she had spent years climbing to this position, years enforcing rules, years being in control, believing she was untouchable. Yet now, in just a few short hours, everything was slipping away from her. She took a deep breath, trying to stand tall, trying to keep moving, trying to pretend she was still in control. But deep down she knew the truth. She had lost control the moment she chose the wrong people to look down on. And now, there was no way to fix it anymore. Mara's hands trembled slightly as she picked up a tray of water, forcing herself to keep moving. She needed to appear normal. She needed to act like nothing had happened. But the heaviness in her chest grew larger and larger. She had dealt with difficult passengers before. She had resolved tense situations. She had even received a few complaints before. But this time was not like the previous times. Because the problem was not just a mistake. But it was that she had chosen the wrong person to eliminate. Mara stepped into the first-class cabin, carefully keeping her face neutral. Arthur Harrington was still sitting there, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest, looking completely relaxed, as if he had forgotten what had happened earlier. But Mara knew better. Eleanor sat next door, flipping through the pages of the in-flight magazine, with absolute elegance and composure. Mara avoided eye contact with them, walked quickly past, stopped at the row 3 seats, where a passenger had just motioned. "For water," she gave a polite smile, forcing her voice back to its familiar soft tone. "Would you like anything, sir?" The man asked for a cup of coffee. She nodded, quickly served, trying to keep everything as normal. Mara felt a little relieved to have something to do. She returned to the kitchen, her mind still spinning with thoughts. Passengers started to notice. Not everyone witnessed the entire exchange earlier, but whispers had spread. A man sitting a few rows away kept glancing, looking at Mara and then at Arthur and Eleanor as if putting the pieces together. Even if Mara wanted to pretend nothing was happening by now, the whole first-class cabin knew something was wrong. Sienna stood near the kitchen entrance, watching as Mara returned to prepare coffee. She hesitated before speaking, her voice low enough that no one else could hear. "I know you don't want to talk, but I think you should prepare yourself." Mara tensed. "Prepare for what?" Sienna bit her lip, carefully considering each word. "Would you like anything, sir?" The man asked for a cup of coffee. She nodded, quickly served, trying to keep everything as normal. Mara felt a little relieved to have something to do. She returned to the kitchen, her mind still spinning with thoughts. Passengers started to notice. Not everyone witnessed the entire exchange earlier, but whispers had spread. A woman sitting across leaned over to her husband, whispering something. A man sitting a few rows away kept glancing, looking at Mara and then at Arthur and Eleanor as if putting the pieces together. Even if Mara wanted to pretend nothing was happening by now, the whole first-class cabin knew something was wrong. Sienna stood near the kitchen entrance, watching as Mara returned to prepare coffee. She hesitated before speaking, her voice low enough that no one else could hear. "I know you don't want to talk, but I think you should prepare yourself." Mara tensed. "Prepare for what?" Sienna bit her lip, carefully considering each word. But nothing was normal anymore. As she turned back to the kitchen, she felt the eyes of many passengers following her. For many years working in the first-class cabin, she always carried absolute confidence, always believing that she had the power. But now, that power was slipping out of her hand with every step. She glanced towards Arthur and Eleanor. They didn't look at her. Arthur was leisurely surfing his phone, occasionally typing a few messages. Eleanor, as elegant as ever, sipped on the sparkling mineral water, the water that another flight attendant had served after Mara refused. That realization made her chest tighten. Someone else had served them. Someone else had done the job she was supposed to do. Mara took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure, and walked quickly towards the kitchen. But as soon as she passed row number 1, a passenger, a middle-aged woman in an elegant blazer, spoke up. "Excuse me." Mara stopped, giving a professional, practiced smile. "Yes, ma'am, how can I help you?" The woman looked at her politely, but in her voice, there was something hidden. "I'm just curious, when did the rules about serving water change?" Mara's stomach churned, but she kept her smile. Sorry, what did you say? The woman gestured slightly towards Arthur and Eleanor. Because I heard clearly what you said to them earlier, and then I saw you serve water to another passenger just 5 minutes later. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes sharp but still polite. I'm just curious, when did the water service policy change? Mara squeezed the tray in her hand, her throat was dry, she had no answer. Mara was not only being questioned, she was being exposed. Other passengers had begun to turn their eyes towards her, subtly but intentionally, pretending to adjust their seats, checking their watches, but everyone was listening very carefully. Mara's heart beat fast. She had two options. 1. Try to defend herself, come up with some explanation. 2. Keep her response short, neutral, hoping the woman would let it go. She forced another smile. I apologize if there was a misunderstanding, ma'am. That wasn't my intention. The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. Mara felt the tension pressing down on her. Every passing second felt more suffocating. The stares from the surrounding passengers grew sharper. She needed to get out of this situation before it got worse. Would you like anything else? She asked quickly, trying to steer the conversation elsewhere. The woman let the silence linger a little too long, before nodding slowly. Just water. Mara clenched her jaw but nodded. Of course. She hurried back to the galley, her heart pounding in her ears. Sienna was already there, having watched the entire exchange. She tilted her head, her voice low but pointed. That went well, huh? Mara glared at her. Drop it. Sienna raised her hands in mock surrender, but her eyes said it all. She knew exactly what was happening. And she wasn't the only one who noticed. Mara grabbed a bottle of water and a glass, preparing to serve the drink. But her hands weren't as steady as before. The weight of her mistake was growing heavier. And though she wanted to appear in control, the reality was becoming clearer than ever. She hadn't just lost Arthur Harrington's respect. She was losing control of the entire first-class cabin. And once that happened, there was no getting it back. Mara took a deep breath, picked up the tray and stepped back into first class. She knew she needed to regain her composure. But the air in the cabin had shifted. It carried something intangible, a wordless tension spreading through the rows. She carefully carried the tray to row 1, setting the glass of water in front of the woman who had confronted her. She braced herself for the woman to say something, to push the issue further. But instead, the woman picked up the glass of water, looked at Mara with an expression that said she understood everything, then turned back to her book. Mara quickly turned away, wanting to escape the situation as fast as possible. But just as she passed Arthur and Eleanor Harrington's seats, a soft but firm voice spoke. Miss Rowan. She froze. Eleanor had spoken. Her voice was still gentle, but it carried a weight that made Mara's entire body stiffen. Slowly Mara turned back, her stomach twisting. She didn't want to meet Eleanor's eyes, but she had no choice. Eleanor set her magazine aside, looking up at Mara with absolute calm, maintaining the elegance she had carried throughout the flight. How much longer until we land? Mara blinked, caught off guard by the question. About 2 more hours, ma'am. Eleanor nodded, as if considering something. Then she smiled. Polite, gentle, but unmistakably intentional. Then there's still plenty of time. Mara didn't understand why, but those words sent chills down her spine. At that moment, Arthur, who had been silent all along, finally spoke. His eyes never left his phone. Miss Rowan, do you believe in responsibility? Mara held her breath for a second. She opened her mouth to answer, but no words came out. The way he asked that question, it wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a statement filled with anger. It was just a test. Mara swallowed hard. Of course, sir. For the first time, Arthur looked up at her. And Mara saw it, the weight of his presence. The kind of power that didn't need to be loud. It didn't need to threaten. He was a man who had built an empire. A man who understood power, influence, and most importantly, how people revealed their nature through their choices. Good. He only said one word, then looked back down at his phone screen without looking at her again. He didn't need to. His silence was enough to dismiss her. Mara stood there for a while longer, not sure if she should say something. Wondering if she could salvage the situation. But what could she say? What was there to salvage? No excuse could make this better. Mara quickly turned away, walking back to the kitchen, feeling a burning sensation spread through her body. She had made mistakes in her career, had faced difficult passengers, had received complaints, but they were always buried in paperwork and never led to any serious consequences. But this time, everything was different. This wasn't a complaint that could be ignored. Not a misunderstanding that could be explained. She had treated Arthur and Eleanor Harrington unfairly. Not because of policy. Not because of airline rules. It was because of her own mistake. And now, that decision was completely destroying her authority, right in front of an entire cabin of passengers. And the worst part? She wasn't sure if she could stop this from happening. The intercom rang again. This time Sienna answered. She was silent, her face grew tense as she listened. Then she looked at Mara, hesitated for a second, then handed her the phone. Her voice was unreadable. "It's for you." Mara's stomach tightened. She knew who it would be before she even put the phone to her ear. "This is Mara Rowan." Her voice was barely a whisper. The reply came immediately. "This is Dominic Carter, Chief Cabin Officer." Mara closed her eyes tightly for a second. She had never spoken directly with Dominic Carter. He was 2 levels above her in the management hierarchy, the one who only handled serious issues, not minor violations. And he didn't wait for her to answer. "As soon as the plane lands, you will have to appear before the executive board. There will be a disciplinary hearing. There will be a formal review of how you handled this flight. Do you understand?" Mara's throat went dry. "Why, yes, sir." A brief silence. Then Dominic Carter's voice lowered, carrying a weight she couldn't ignore. "You should know one thing, Miss Rowan. Mr. Harrington is not the type to demand punishment." Mara felt a flicker of hope. But it was immediately crushed by his next words. "He is the type to change policy." Mara's breath caught. This was no longer just about her. No longer just a personal mistake. The way she had handled this flight would become a turning point in the airline's policy. Dominic Carter continued, "Do not approach the Harringtons again. All interactions between you and them are over. The executive board will handle the rest." The call was cut off. Mara lowered the phone slowly, her hands cold. Sienna was still standing there, her eyes saying that she had heard enough to understand what was happening. "Are you okay?" she began, but Mara immediately cut her off. "I don't want to talk." Her voice was sharper than she intended. She turned away, gripping the edge of the counter, feeling the weight of the entire situation crash down on her. She had spent years controlling everything, believing she was in charge. But now, she wasn't even allowed to speak to the passengers she had wronged. For the first time in her career, Mara Rowan realized that she was completely powerless. Mara stared at the intercom, its silence like a mockery. Her mind still reeling. But the reality was becoming clear. There was no way out of this. No way to settle it smoothly. No way to write a report and move on as if nothing happened. She had lost control of this flight. Lost her authority. And now she was losing her own future. Sienna still watched Mara from across the kitchen, her arms crossed, eyes cautious. She wanted to say something, that was obvious. But she knew better than to push Mara right now. Mara took a shaky breath, trying to regain her composure. She needed to maintain professionalism. She needed to act as if nothing was happening. As if she wasn't facing a hearing that could end her career. With stiff movements, she reached for a tray of food, pretending to focus on arranging it. As if keeping herself busy would make her disappear from this situation. Sienna sighed softly, stepping closer. "Do you realize what's happening?" Mara clenched her jaw. "Not now, Sienna." "No, I think now is the perfect time." Sienna's voice was gentle but firm. "Because you're acting like this is just a minor inconvenience with a passenger. Like it will disappear when the plane lands." Mara tightened her grip on the tray in her hands. Sienna sighed, her voice lowering. "You didn't just upset a first-class passenger, Mara. You disrespected Arthur and Eleanor Harrington. The people who own this airline." Mara flinched at those words. She had known this. But hearing it said aloud made the weight of it press down on her even harder. Sienna shook her head. "Do you understand what that means?" She emphasized. "It means whatever happens when we land, it's not just about you anymore. It's about the changes that will happen because of you." Mara felt her stomach tighten, but she didn't respond. Sienna stepped closer, looking directly into her eyes. "I've seen you ignore passengers before. Seen you make those small choices, decisions about who gets special treatment and who doesn't." She paused, her gaze sharp. "But this time you picked the wrong person. And now, everyone is watching." Mara's head snapped up, looking straight at Sienna. The air between them was tense, a silent understanding. Sienna was right. Mara had always been careful. Always subtle in her actions. But this time she had picked the wrong person to disregard. And now the consequences were unfolding right before her eyes. The first-class passengers were whispering. She could feel their eyes on her. Feel the shift in the atmosphere. They had seen what happened. They had recognized the injustice. And even if they didn't speak up now, they would remember. And if they remembered, they will tell. She had seen this happen before. A social media post goes viral. A passenger tells the story to the right person. And suddenly, a small incident turns into a company-wide scandal. Mara's chest tightened. She needed to think. She needed a way out of this. She pressed her fingers to her temples, taking a deep breath. I can fix this, she muttered as if trying to convince herself. No, Sienna cut in, shaking her head. You can't. Mara blinked, shocked by the absolute certainty in Sienna's voice. The young flight attendant's gaze was unreadable, but deep down there was something like disappointment. There is nothing you can say to make this better. The decision is no longer in your hands. Mara's breath caught. She had spent her entire career being the decision maker. The one in control of the situation. The one who determined the outcome of every scenario. But now she could only wait for judgment. And for someone like Mara Rowan, that was the worst punishment. Her stomach tightened, but before she could respond, a voice echoed through the intercom, "Crew, prepare for initial descent." Those words hit her like a cold wave. The flight was about to end. And her real nightmare was about to begin. For the first time in her career, Mara wished for a longer flight. Because once the plane landed, she would no longer be the decision maker. She would be the one judged. She swallowed hard as the captain's voice faded through the intercom. The heaviness in her chest grew. Initial descent. It meant that in less than 30 minutes the plane would land. In less than 30 minutes before she had to step off the plane, walk through the airport and step into the executive boardroom, where the leaders were already waiting. She had controlled the first-class cabin for many years. She set the rules. She decided who deserved special attention and who didn't. Every decision she had made on this flight would be dissected, analyzed, and used to decide if she had a future with this airline. Mara's stomach tightened. Sienna was still standing near the kitchen, watching her. But this time she said nothing. Because there was nothing left to say. Mara took a deep breath, forcing herself to stand tall. She had two choices. 1. Let this situation crush her. 2. Act as if she still had control. She turned, adjusting the trays of food, pretending to focus on her work. She just focused on the small tasks. Maybe she could silence the storm raging in her mind. But as she stepped into the first-class cabin, she realized one thing. The passengers weren't just glancing at her anymore. They were watching her. The subtle but unmistakable shift. The businessman in seat 1 still had his face buried in his tablet, but she noticed the way his fingers hesitated before typing. The woman who had questioned her earlier now had her arms crossed, her eyes constantly flicking to Arthur and Eleanor, as if waiting for something. Even the other flight attendants moved more cautiously around her, as if intentionally keeping their distance, avoiding the impending fallout. Mara's heart pounded. She was no longer invisible. For years, she could navigate flights with absolute authority, silently making decisions, choosing who mattered and who wasn't worth noticing. But now, she was the one being judged in silence. The feeling was unfamiliar. Uncomfortable. Bare. She stepped forward to the front of the first-class cabin, where Eleanor sat, her hands lightly clasped on her lap, completely calm. Beside her, Arthur was still typing something on his phone, his expression unreadable. Mara's mouth went dry. Since she was forced to apologize, the Harringtons had barely looked at her. And that was worse than if they had been visibly angry. She hesitated. Should she say something? Anything? But she knew. That moment had passed. Her fate was no longer in her hands. Instead, she stiffly turned, preparing to head back to the kitchen. The intercom rang again. The sound made her jump. For the first time, she hesitated before answering. She didn't want to hear what was coming. But she had no other choice. Trying to stay calm, she picked up the phone, forcing her voice to be professional. "This is Mara Rowan." A deep, calm voice came from the other end. "Ms. Rowan, this is James Caldwell, Executive Vice President." Mara held her breath. James Caldwell. She had never spoken to him directly. Only knew his name from high-level documents. What was about to happen would not just be a simple reprimand. James Caldwell. If he had intervened, then this was no longer just an internal review. This was an executive disciplinary hearing. Mara tightened her grip on the phone, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes, sir." A brief silence. Then the calm but sharp voice continued, "After landing, you will not disembark with the crew. You will stay on the plane, waiting for security personnel to escort you to the executive office. Mara's stomach felt like it dropped. Security? She weakly repeated. Yes. You will be immediately suspended from duty until the investigation is complete. Those words hit her like a punch to the chest. She had braced herself for a formal hearing, maybe even a written reprimand. But immediate suspension? Her mouth opened but no words came out. James Caldwell continued, his voice cold, leaving no room for argument. The report has been filed. Mr. Harrington personally requested this matter be reviewed at the highest level. Mara's heart pounded. Worse than she had imagined. Arthur Harrington didn't ask for her to be fired. He didn't make a scene. He was doing something even more powerful. He was ensuring that what she had done would be documented, thoroughly analyzed, and become a prime example for policy change. She could see the headlines forming in her mind. Bias in first class. Are airline employees truly impartial? How a decision at 30,000 feet changed the entire airline industry. Her mind was in turmoil. But Caldwell's voice cut through her thoughts. Do you understand these instructions, Miss Rowan? Mara swallowed hard, her throat tightening. Yes, sir. Good. We land in 20 minutes. The call ended with a decisive click. Mara slowly lowered the phone, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She turned slightly and for the first time, her eyes met Arthur Harrington's gaze. He hadn't looked at her once since their earlier interaction. But now, as the final moments in the air were passing, he looked up and held her gaze. There was no anger. No gloating. Just a calmness. A silent authority. And that was worse than anything else. Because it meant he had won. Mara spun around, quickly walking towards the kitchen, every movement stiff, emotionless. She had 20 minutes left in the air. 20 minutes before she stepped off this plane and faced the fate that awaited her. For the first time in her career, she was truly afraid. The plane began its descent. The lights dimmed slightly, passengers adjusted their seats, preparing for landing. Mara stood in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. The cold reality pressed down on her chest, heavier than ever before. This wasn't just a reprimand. Not just a simple complaint. This was a judgment. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her trembling hands. She needed to keep her composure. At least until they land. No one could see her like this. Weak. Broken. She had always been the one in control. The one who set the rules. But now she had nothing left. No longer a head flight attendant. No longer an airline employee. She was just an example. A lesson for everyone. A warning about what not to do. And Arthur Harrington, he didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't ask her to apologize. He had done something even more ruthless, that he had set the wheels of change in motion. Mara tilted her head slightly, looking towards the first-class cabin. She could still feel the shift in the atmosphere. The passengers were still whispering. Their furtive glances at her when they thought she wasn't looking. Some of them might forget this as soon as they left the airport. But others, they would talk about it. They would tell their family and friends. Maybe, they would post it online. And when a story like this spreads, it wouldn't just be about Mara Rowan anymore. It would become about all those moments like this. Every unwritten rule. Every biased decision made in silence. Every passenger who was dismissed just because they didn't look like they belonged. Mara's heartbeat skyrocketed. She turned away, unable to look into Sienna's piercing eyes. The final announcement echoed through the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now in the final approach. Please fasten your seatbelts, fold away your tray tables, and stow your luggage securely. Passengers shifted, preparing for the familiar landing. For them, this was just another flight. But for Mara, these were the final moments of the career she had known. Her breath was quick and unsteady. Then, it happened. The plane touched down on the runway. A smooth landing. And with it, everything in Mara Rowan's life officially changed forever. Passengers relaxed after landing, the tension of the flight gradually leaving their bodies. For everyone else, the journey was over. But for Mara, it had just begun. She remained in place, her stomach churning with each passing second. The seatbelt sign turned off with a ding. Passengers stretched, reaching for their bags. Conversation started to spread through the cabin. She could almost convince herself that this was just a normal landing. Until she saw them. Security personnel. They were waiting right at the plane's door. Two of them, standing tall in uniform, their eyes fixed on the exit. As if they were waiting for someone. Waiting for her. Mara's whole body went numb. This wasn't just a suspension. This was an escort. The reality hit her. She wouldn't step off the plane like a regular flight attendant, head held high, ready for the next shift. No, she would be taken away. Right in front of everyone. The conversations in the first-class cabin gradually quieted down. The passengers realized what was happening. Some understood immediately. The rest would find out in a few minutes. Mara clenched her teeth, trying to keep her face expressionless. But her hands were still trembling. She wasn't used to this. She was used to giving orders. Used to making decisions. Used to controlling the situation. But now she was the one being watched. She turned her head slightly. Her eyes met Arthur and Eleanor Harrington's gaze. They still sat there, still calm, as if they had known from the beginning how this flight would end for her. Arthur looked down at his watch. Not because he was in a hurry. Arthur didn't look at his watch out of impatience. Not out of arrogance. It was just a silent confirmation. Everything was going as planned. Eleanor's eyes met Mara's for a brief moment. There was no tension. No hostility. Just understanding. And that was worse than anything else. Mara wanted them to be angry. Wanted them to raise their voices. Wanted them to demand something. Wanted something to fight against. But no. This was not a dispute. This was justice. Moving forward. Without her. Mara took a deep breath, bracing herself. She had no other choice. The plane door opened. First-class passengers slowly stood up. Some glanced at her with curiosity. Others pretended not to notice, but their curiosity was obvious. Mara remained still. She knew what was about to happen. A security officer stepped forward, stopping right beside her. His voice was calm and professional. "Miss Rowan, please follow us." The final confirmation. This was not a request. Mara's chest tightened. But she just nodded stiffly, not saying a word. She stepped forward. Walking past the passengers. Those who once saw her as an authority figure. Now they only saw a person who had lost everything. She walked down the aisle, her steps stiff and forced. No one stopped her. No one spoke up for her. And as she stepped through the door, leaving the first-class cabin, she realized one truth. It was never about the glass of water. It was never about a small mistake. It was always about the choices she made. And the people she hurt. And now she would have to live with that choice forever. Mara stepped into the jet bridge, the cold artificial air hitting her face like a slap. In the distance she heard the hum of the airport, a world she once belonged to. But no longer. The noise of the airport echoed through the walls. But inside, there was absolute silence. 2 security officers walked on either side, their steps synchronized with hers, each stride precise, rigid. Mara used to walk through these airports with confidence, wearing her uniform like a badge of authority. But now she just felt like a prisoner being escorted to her trial. Her mind raced. There had to be a way out of this. A way to turn the story around. To mitigate what had happened. To save what was left of her career. Maybe if she presented this as a misunderstanding. Maybe if she asserted that she was just following procedure. But deep down she knew it was never about the procedure. No one cared if she followed policy. It was about how she wielded her power. And now, the people who gave her that power were taking it away. The doors at the end of the jet bridge slid open, revealing the terminal. Mara held her breath. She saw them immediately. 2 senior airline executives. Standing right beyond the security checkpoint. One of them, a tall man, silver hair, sharp suit. James Caldwell. Executive Vice President. He stood with his hands clasped, saying nothing. Just standing there. And Mara understood immediately. This was no longer an internal review. Next to him, Dominic Carter. Chief Cabin Officer. His expression was unreadable. But Mara didn't need to guess. He wasn't there to hear her excuses. Passengers from the flight began to spill into the terminal. Some noticed the scene. Some whispered to each other. And some had already taken out their phones. Mara knew. This wouldn't end here. A wave of panic surged in her chest. Were they filming? She could almost see the headlines forming in her mind. Police car light, first-class flight attendant escorted off plane by security after dispute with airline owners. Police car light social media posts. Whispers. Speculations. Nausea twisted in her stomach. James Caldwell turned to look at Mara, his eyes cold, assessing. "Miss Rowan." His voice was calm but firm. "Follow us." The security officers stepped aside, creating a path. Mara hesitated for a second, then forced her legs to move. She kept her shoulders straight, her face expressionless. But inside, her mind was spinning. She followed Caldwell and Carter, walking into a private airport corridor, away from the public eye. The stark white walls. Bright overhead lights. Every footstep echoed, steady, determined, like a drum counting down to her fate. After a few minutes they stopped in front of a frosted glass door. A metal plaque read, "Executive Review Room." Caldwell swiped his card, the door opened. Inside, a long, luxurious conference table stretched the length of the room. 3 senior executives were already seated, their faces expressionless, unreadable. And at the head of the table, Arthur Harrington. Mara's breath caught. Worse than she imagined. This was no longer just a disciplinary hearing. This was personal. The weight of what she had done now fully on her shoulders. She had decided that Arthur Harrington and his wife didn't belong in first class. And now she was standing on his turf. On his terms. Caldwell pointed to the chair opposite Arthur. "Sit down." Mara hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But there was no escape. The weight of judgment pressed down on her. But there was nowhere to run. Mara pulled out the chair, slowly sitting down. Arthur Harrington leaned back in his chair, calm. Controlled. Unreadable. He watched her for a long moment, his fingers casually intertwined. Then finally he spoke. "Miss Rowan." His voice steady, unwavering. "Do you know why you are here?" Mara's throat tightened. "Yes, sir." Arthur nodded slowly. "Good." Pause. Then he leaned forward slightly. His voice still calm but carrying the weight of a man with absolute power. "Now tell me, why did you think we didn't belong there?" Mara's heart pounded so hard she thought it might shake the room. Because there was no right answer to that question. And there never had been. Her throat was dry. Her hands slick with sweat, the coldness of the table surface brushing her fingertips. The air in the room heavier than necessary. The silence between her and Arthur Harrington, like an invisible weight, pressed down on her chest. She had faced difficult conversations before. Angry passengers. Impatient executives. Tense arguments with the crew. But never had she had to sit across from a man. Could decide her entire future with just one word. Arthur's gaze didn't waver. Patient but unyielding. "Why did you think we didn't belong there?" The question echoed in her mind. It collided with every excuse she had rehearsed before entering this room. But none of them fit. Because there was no way to explain this without making her look worse. Mara swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the hem of her uniform. She knew, the moment she opened her mouth, everything would be over. Mara looked around the room, searching for anything, anyone to relieve the pressure weighing down on her. James Caldwell. Dominic Carter. They sat on either side of Arthur, quietly observing, their faces expressionless, unreadable. The other 3 executives, people whose names she couldn't even remember, also kept silent, just looking at her with assessing eyes. But the worst thing? Eleanor Harrington was also present. She sat a few seats away, elegant as always, her fingers gently resting on a porcelain teacup that someone had prepared for her. And unlike Arthur, she didn't look at her with judgmental eyes. No. Her gaze was even worse. Disappointment. Mara forced herself to speak. I didn't mean." Arthur raised a hand slightly, stopping her before she could dig herself deeper. "Be clear, Miss Rowan." His voice steady and calm. "I don't need polished corporate excuses." He tilted his head slightly, his eyes still locked on hers. "I want the truth." Mara's heart pounded. She had been trained to handle difficult conversations. She knew how to defuse a situation, knew how to shift blame without anyone noticing. But no tactic could help her now. Not when everything was laid bare. Her mouth opened then closed again. She had no answer. Or rather, she had no answer that wouldn't make her the kind of person the airline wanted to get rid of immediately. Arthur leaned back slightly, watching her hesitation. "You were very comfortable refusing to serve us, Miss Rowan. You were very confident in making that decision." He tilted his head, his gaze icy. "Where is that confidence now?" Mara's stomach tightened. She looked at James Caldwell, hoping he would intervene. But he just lifted his hand, adjusting his watch. No one would save her. It was clear he wouldn't step in. She was all alone. Mara took a shaky breath, trying to choose her words carefully. "I didn't mean to treat you unfairly. I just misjudged." Eleanor gently stirred her tea, calm, unhurried. Then she looked up, her gaze meeting Mara's. "A misjudgment?" she repeated, her voice smooth as silk. "How interesting." The way she said it sent a chill down Mara's spine. Arthur clasped his hands on the table, nodding slowly. "Then let's test that theory. Assuming this was indeed a mistake." He tilted his head slightly, his eyes locked on hers. "Tell me, Miss Rowan, how many times have you misjudged first-class passengers?" How many times have you denied simple requests, just because someone didn't look like they belonged there? Mara froze. That was the trap. If she denied it, she would sound like she was erasing past behavior. If she admitted it, she would confirm exactly what Arthur already knew. Either way, she had lost. Mara gripped the edge of her chair, her breath uneven. Eleanor set down her spoon, the clink of metal against porcelain rang out. I think we both know the answer. Her voice was gentle, but each word was a cold blade. Mara's chest tightened. She had spent years walking through the first-class cabin, deciding who would receive special attention, who would get easy smiles, who would be prioritized without question, and who wouldn't. She had done it so many times, so effortlessly, that she never stopped to think about what it meant. Until now. Arthur inhaled lightly, not out of fatigue or annoyance, but as a calculated pause. The silence squeezed the air out of the room. Then he turned to James Caldwell. Is this the type of leadership you want in your airline? Do you want this kind of leadership running the first-class cabin? Mara's stomach sank. James Caldwell, who had remained silent throughout the meeting, slowly adjusted his suit cuffs. He didn't look at Mara as he replied. No, sir. 2 simple words. But like a dagger to her chest. She was losing. She was losing everything. Mara tried to straighten her back, trying to keep her voice steady. I understand I've made a mistake, but You didn't make a mistake. Arthur interrupted, his voice cold as steel. A mistake is forgetting to bring coffee to a passenger. A mistake is mixing up meal orders. He leaned forward, his eyes still piercing her. What you did was a choice. The word cut through her like a sharp blade. Choice. She felt her breath catch. Her composure was slipping out of control. Eleanor spoke, her voice gentle but firm. What you did to us today, Miss Rowan, wasn't the first time we've experienced such treatment. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharp as a razor. But I wonder, if we weren't the owners of this airline, would you ever have reconsidered your actions? Mara had no answer. And that was the answer. The room fell into an eerie silence. Arthur leaned back in his chair, exhaling lightly, as if everything had gone exactly as he predicted. Then he turned to James Caldwell. She's done. Mara's blood felt like it froze. Caldwell nodded, his expression unreadable. Effective immediately, Mara Rowan is terminated from the airline. Mara's hands trembled under the table. Please. She whispered, her voice so small it was barely audible. Is there no other way? Arthur just looked at her, his voice steady, unwavering. There's nothing more to say. Mara felt her breath shatter in her chest. Eleanor took a final sip of her tea, setting the cup down gently. Eleanor placed the teacup down, the sound gentle but colder than any words. I suggest you take some time to think about the kind of person you chose to become. And with that, she stood up. Arthur buttoned his jacket, turning towards the door. The remaining executives stood up as well, walking out without a backward glance. Mara sat there, completely motionless, her mind spinning, watching the people who had held her fate. Without a word of comfort, without a look of pity, without a chance to explain. She was not just fired. She was rendered meaningless. The door softly closed, leaving her alone. No job, no title, no power. For the first time in her life, Mara Rowan was just a nobody. She remained still, staring at the chair where Arthur and Eleanor Harrington had just sat minutes ago. The silence in the room suffocated her. Their final words kept echoing in her mind, word by word, heavier than their own weight. She was finished, fired, not reprimanded, not suspended, but eliminated. She had once believed she was untouchable. She had once thought she understood the unwritten rules of first class, how everything operated. But today she was the one being eliminated. The weight of this moment pressed down on her, making each breath harder. She clenched her hands, nails digging into her palms, trying to hold on to anything left. This shouldn't have happened. All she did was follow the usual path. The small, silent decisions she had made for years. She hadn't thought twice about refusing to bring water to Arthur and Eleanor. She didn't feel she was doing anything wrong. But now she could see it. Now she could hear it. The deafening silence had surrounded her from the moment she made that choice. Their eyes had changed. She had ignored Sienna. She had refused to see what was right in front of her. And now she was paying the price. Her heart raced, a dizzying sensation reaching to her very bones as the truth hit with full force. It wasn't just about losing her job. It was about losing her dignity, her name, her face, now attached to a story much larger than herself. She could imagine it. Passengers would talk. News would spread. Police car light, first-class flight attendant fired after mistreating airline owners. Police car light, but that wasn't the real story. The real story was how she got here. Had she ever stopped to wonder how many people she had treated differently over the years? How many passengers had sat in those seats, feeling her judgmental gaze but choosing to remain silent? How many times she had pushed someone aside, sure they weren't important enough to bother with? Her stomach twisted. Because for the first time, she realized that this was never just about Arthur and Eleanor Harrington. It was about everyone else. The passengers before them. The silent injustices. The choices she had made without hesitation. And now she was no longer Mara Rowan, the head flight attendant. She was Mara Rowan, the lesson. Her name would be mentioned in training sessions, in executive meetings, in discussions about bias in the airline industry. Her name wouldn't be forgotten. But not in the way she had hoped. Knock knock. A sharp knock startled her. The door opened. A security officer stepped in, his face professional, impassive. "Miss Rowan." His voice was calm but left no room for options. "We need to escort you out now." Her throat went dry. Mara nodded slowly, forcing herself to stand up. Her legs trembled. Every step unsteady. The uniform she once wore with pride now suffocated her. The private staff corridor stretched out, daunting. The security officers said nothing, nor did she. As they reached the crew exit, Mara hesitated for a split second. But then she had to step outside. The airport lights glared on her skin, harsh and bitter. Airport staff walked by, none of them glanced her way. She had once been a figure of authority. Someone passengers trusted. Someone colleagues turned to for guidance. But now she was just a nameless face in the crowd. No uniform. No power. No job. All that was left was Mara Rowan. An ordinary person quietly leaving the airport. She glanced to her left, her eyes landing on the large digital announcement board near the terminal entrance. A new announcement had appeared. Police car light, Whitmore Airlines implements new first-class service policy. Police car light, stricter bias control training for all crew members. Police car light, effective immediately. Mara's breath caught in her throat. Her fingers trembled as she stared at the words. Reality was sinking in. Everything was over. What she did wasn't just noticed. It had changed the entire airline. A policy overhaul. A shift in how things would operate from now on. And her name would never be forgotten. She walked away, but no destination awaited her. No more uniform to wear. No more flight schedule to follow. No next flight to prepare for. She had once believed she controlled everything. But now, she was just an ordinary person watching the world continue without her. And she could do nothing to change that. Never again. Final destination. Mara walked slowly, each step heavy as if she were dragging her entire past with her. She walked past waiting passengers, new flight attendants smiling confidently, pilots preparing for takeoff, all with a place to go, except her. She had once thought the airport was her home. But now the door had closed at a world with no place for her. She left the airport, out to the parking lot, where the streetlights cast long shadows on the cold concrete. No crew shuttles. No next flight to prepare for. No team of attendants waiting for her direction. She was just herself. And an endless void of the future ahead. She reached for her phone, her fingers still trembling from the shock. Her contact list empty of anyone willing to help. Previous calls went unanswered. What could she do? Where would she go? A final call. Mara took a deep breath, slowly scrolling through her contacts looking for a name, someone not from her old world. A name appeared on the screen. Daniel Carter. A hotel chain manager. An old friend who had once told her, "If you ever need a fresh start, call me." She had laughed at the offer back then. Now it was her only chance. She pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a warm, familiar voice answered. "Mara?" She swallowed hard, words stuck in her throat. "Daniel, does your offer still stand?" He was silent for a few seconds, but when he answered, his voice was firm. "Are you ready to start from scratch?" She closed her eyes, the image of the airport fading from her mind. She was no longer the Mara Rowan of yesterday. "Yes." On the other end, Daniel chuckled softly. "All right, tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. I'll send the address." A new beginning. The call ended. Mara stood there, looking back at the distant airport one last time. Then she turned and walked away. Not because she wanted to leave, but because she no longer belonged there. But this time, she was walking towards something new. And that was truly her first destination.